Hello. All right. So today we're going to talk about Chapter 12, Early American Societies and Economics. I already blasted through in class the late 1800s economic stuff. So once again, a bunch of inventions help industrialize the United States. We highlighted Lowell Mills. You guys read about Lowell Mills and the women who work there. We talked about transportation really speeding up. And I get it, like going 6 miles an hour or 4 miles an hour isn't that fast, but it's a lot faster than trying to struggle on a turnpike, or even worse than a turnpike, like a rural road. So we get our stuff around a lot faster and a lot cheaper. Okay, more economic stuff. So in 1860, we'll talk more about this later. We are in what is politically called the era of good feeling. The Federalist Party has died. The Federalist Party, remember during the War of 1812, the Federalist Party was kind of not patriotic and even played with leaving the Union. So the Federalists are now gone. We will not see the Federalists anymore. We are left with pretty much just the Democratic Republican Party left. And yes, there are some divisions within regions, but overall, we're pretty unified. And entering onto this scene, we are economically going to pass what is called the American system. The American system has three components economically that the federal government is going to get involved in. The guy who proposes the American system is Henry Clay. Henry Clay is a slaveholder from Kentucky. He is, as everybody is in the era, a Democratic Republican, and he's relatively young. He comes into the House of Representatives, eventually goes into the Senate, but he is going to be key to passing this American system. So there's going to be three parts, like I said. First off, the old bus that we'd established back in the 1700s under Hamilton had expired. The charter had expired, and Henry Clay is going to bring back the second bus. Now, what does that mean? The bus can control the money supply. They can issue currency. They can take in the federal government's money and store it. This is a dollar bill issued by the Bank of the United States. So it made the money supply more controllable. So they could control interest rates, what could stimulate or not stimulate the economy. Now, the perception about the bus is that it's controlled by elites who use interest rates to benefit the banks. So generally speaking, the perception is eventually going to be that the bus keeps interest rates too high. But the flip side is people also distrust the bus because they issue paper money, which, remember, paper money isn't actually valuable because it's paper. It's valuable because people think they can turn it in for something valuable. So there's going to be a whole conflict over that soon. Tariffs. There's an idea that we're going to put a tax on foreign goods, and that is going to protect American industry, which is in its infancy right now. So here's the Merrimack Corporation. It's on the Merrimack River in Massachusetts. This is another textile factory. Okay, and we're trying to keep British textiles expensive and buy American. We put a tariff on basically every manufactured good. And finally, the government is going to sponsor internal improvements. For example, we're going to build a national road, as I mentioned earlier, from Maryland all the way out to St. Louis. And there's also canals sponsored by the federal government, roadways, that kind of thing. Okay, society. So education. There is very much an emphasis on education in this era. The idea of having public schools spreads from New England all the way through the northern part of the country. They are funded by taxpayers. Remember, as part of the Northwest Ordinance and the township and range system, part of the land is devoted to being sold to pay for public schools. So even if you look in this area, there are a lot of former rural public schools. My mom, who's now 72 or so, went to a one-room schoolhouse that was a legacy of this whole early schoolhouse. My mom graduated high school in 1968. So in the 50s, she was going to a one-room school, part of this tradition. Also, private academies are set up. So these are essentially private schools for elite people. So you might send your daughter to a finishing school, they called it, where they would learn how to read and write, but they'd also learn how to knit and cook and can and all those kinds of things. But that was more for elite, like it's refining these women down who are from upper class, well educated. But there's also private academies for wealthy boys. Generally, these academies are segregated by gender, so all girl, all boy. There's a new emphasis on educating women. Women, we need to educate because they need to understand democracy. And that's what the idea of Republican motherhood, or Republican mother. You educate women about democracy so they can teach their kids about democracy. That is the woman's role. Now, granted, women can't vote yet. Ooh, scary. We don't want them to vote, but they are going to raise their children to be good citizens. That's the idea of Republican mother or Republican motherhood. So this is sort of a stereotypical, like idealized image of like the woman is the center of the family and taking care of her kids, and here's the husband as the breadwinner. The cult of domesticity is sort of an offshoot of Republican motherhood. Cult of domesticity says the woman should be worshipped in her role as homemaker, as the center of the home. The man goes out and does things in the cruel world. The man gets a job. The man makes money. The woman nurtures children. She teaches them democracy, Republican motherhood, teaches her girls how to be a female person, all those stereotypes, and lays the basis for the sons to eventually become people working outside the home. So part of this goes into industrialization, that whole era, because men can now work outside the home. If everybody's a farmer, basically men and women are working together. Yes, women might stereotypically be inside the house, but women might also go in the barn and do stuff. So I would argue that some of the economic growth from the era allows you to segregate things by gender. Native Americans, there is going to be an emphasis on Native American education. And in fact, there are a couple tribes that, in fact, developed their own languages. And there are a couple schools set up particularly to educate Native Americans or Indians. I'm going to use both those terms in this class probably equally. There are different tribes that are okay with being called Indians. Others prefer Native Americans, kind of go both ways. And there's also an increase in the number of colleges. I think by 1820 or so, there was something like 27 colleges in the United States. And they're a very small minority of people. I mean, we're talking a fraction of 1% of Americans have college degrees. It's basically open exclusively to males, but there's more available than there were, say, at the time of the American Revolution, when there was 9 colleges or something like in the whole country. Okay, American literature. American is going to develop its own set of literature. Up until this point, that's not to say there weren't American authors, but a lot of the best literature in America was simply imported from England. So first, we're going to sort of solidify American English, and that's done by Noah Webster in his dictionaries. You will note that sometimes there are spellings that are different in England than they are in the United States. And part of that is in this era, the British write their own dictionaries separate from American dictionaries. So there really is an American English and a English in England. Not a ton of difference, but that kind of solidifies spelling. Prior to 1806, you could kind of spell things the way you wanted. As long as people could get the message across, there wasn't a correct spelling. I'm a terrible speller. I would have loved it. One of the early American authors that you may have heard of, or at least his stories, Washington Irving, published the story of Ichabod Crane. It was a movie in the last 10 or 15 years. That's the story of Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman. That's Ichabod Crane. Remember, he's chased by a ghost Hessian, former rent-a-soldier for the British from Germany, and that story. And then Rip Van Winkle is the story of a guy in upstate New York who falls asleep and comes back 40 years later, or wakes up, I think it's 20 years later, and finds the world different. And he's done both anyway. Some American stories. And then in my least favorite American author, we have Mason Weems. Mason Weems is a guy who believes that historical figures' lives should be a morality play. That we don't look at the complexity of our American heroes. We should just make them look to be 100% heroes. So Mason Weems writes a biography of the life of Washington, George Washington. And in it, he says some things that are true about George Washington, but makes up a ton of stuff about George Washington. So the kids reading the book are like, oh, he's a hero. He's larger than life. He's perfect. So you ever heard the story about George Washington cutting down the cherry tree? And his dad says, did you cut down the cherry tree? And then Washington says, I cannot tell a lie. I cut down the cherry tree. Well, okay. There's no evidence he ever did that. Like, why would you be motivated to cut down a cherry tree when you're a kid? Is that like a fun thing to do? To go cut cherry trees? Another story Mason Weems tells is that George Washington was so strong he could throw a silver dollar across the Potomac. Well, if you ever see where George Washington's plantation was, throwing a silver dollar across the Potomac would be like throwing a silver dollar a quarter mile. You're not going to do it. So a lot of we're trying to have morality in here with the history, and like I get it, but to a point, you just don't make up lies about people, which is what Mason Weems did. Religion. Religion is a very interesting phase for religion. So there are Americans who are becoming less fixated on just Christianity. In fact, some Americans are what we call deists. Deists believe there's a God. God created the earth with natural laws and then left. So Thomas Jefferson would be considered a deist, believed in God, but was not particularly enamored with Christianity or any religion. He's like, yep, we like God. We're just not going to focus here. In fact, he created his own version of the Bible where he cut out all of the miracles done in the New Testament and just looked at what the teachings of Christ were, looking out for poor people and loving your neighbor as yourself. But if there's a story about someone being raised from the dead, he cut that out of the Bible. So that was actually something Jefferson did. There's also another way of looking at religion, universalism or Unitarianism. There's a slight difference between the two of them, but for our purposes, Universalists and Unitarians believe that every religion has an element of truth to it. So if you're a Unitarian, if you are involved in Unitarianism, their church services would be, hey, we're going to read something from the Quran. Oh, here's something from the Torah. Oh, here's something from the Bible. And you try to glean the truth about God and life from different sources. There's actually a Unitarian church in Madison, right across from UW Hospital. Building itself was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, actually. So kind of interesting. However, so this is very not traditional. However, around 1800, we have the Second Great Awakening. And we already had a First Great Awakening. That's the one that we had in the 1730s and 40s. That was sort of splitting up the old line Protestant churches up in New England. The Second Great Awakening is going to have impacts on a couple other religions. So Second Great Awakening is all about your personal relationship with Jesus Christ. It is not related so much to, hey, interpreting the Bible and theology, which tends to be more perceived as Catholic in nature. These guys are like emotional. Like you need to receive Christ and feel God. And the Methodist and the Baptist churches really are inspired and spread via the Second Great Awakening. They have these massive camp meetings where people would pitch tents and spend a week listening to preachers. So this is an example of a camp meeting. I mean, you have people here sometimes speaking in tongues, fainting, feeling God. Think of a televangelist. Like it's that kind of enthusiasm. For most people who did this, it was one of the most spiritual moments of their lives to get together and hear these preachers. Very evangelical. And what I mean by evangelical is we are going to spread the word of God. This is like, we're not going to keep it. We are going to spread it. Women are involved. There are female preachers. Tends to be more rural and southern. So I actually had you take a look at people who are Baptists. This is as of 2000. The Baptists are all through the South, and this is a legacy of the Second Great Awakening, which swept through the South. You go to the South today, virtually every city of any size is going to have a Methodist church and a Baptist church. And in fact, it impacts African Americans and Native Americans. So there's what's called an AME, African Methodist Episcopalian Church, that is a predominantly African American organization that comes out of this. Slaves, there's an emphasis on teaching slaves Christianity, which a lot of slaves buy into because if you look at the Old Testament, there's stories of escaping from slavery with the Jews, and that really resonates with slaves. So they could be Christian, but also have these subtle digs against slavery by being sympathetic to the Jews. This burned over country is also in other rural areas, like in upstate New York. There was an area that was very evangelical and had this Second Great Awakening. So today, I think the United States is still living a lot of the Second Great Awakening. If you are in a Protestant church right now, that is, we would even call themselves an evangelical church, they are in the spirit of the Second Great Awakening. There's generally, with a lot of these churches, there may be a central authority, but it's not like a worldwide authority. So like there's a U.S. Baptist church, U.S. Methodist church, but it's not like the Pope in Rome is telling Catholics what to do. So it's a lot more decentralized also. There's a formal system for preaching, but in some cases, if you want to become a preacher and you're good at speaking, you can just say, I'm a preacher. Okay, westward expansion. People indeed start moving westward. In fact, the population from 1800 to 1820 is going to double, or roughly double. if you can put that in proportion, that would be like in the next 20 years, the population of the United States becoming 700 million. Not going to happen. We're about 350 million right now. Settlement in what's called the Old Northwest. Today, when I was talking, I actually missed my state dates. So Ohio, statehood 1803, Indiana 1816, and Illinois was actually earlier than I thought. It's 1818. So a lot of this Northwest territory is gaining statehood. Easterners move west. So generally speaking, if you're from New England, you go into Wisconsin, Indiana. If you're from Virginia, you move westward. So there's very little like I'm moving from the Northeast down to the Southwest. Happens, but much more rare. The plantation society and the idea of having cotton crops moves west also. So just as the cotton gin is getting invented and they're perfecting this whole let's grow lots of cotton in places like South Carolina, plantation owners from there are like, I can get a lot cheaper land out west, and they move into Mississippi and Alabama, which both get statehood in the 18 teens. So pretty rapid westward expansion, filling up stuff up to the Mississippi River. And in fact, even getting settlement in Missouri by the 1820s. And then on the frontier in Wisconsin at this point, we have fur trapping. So there's a company called the American Fur Trade Company, owned by John Jacob Astor. In fact, you ever seen the movie Titanic? His grandson dies in the Titanic. Anyway, fur trapping, they have this massive fur empire in Louisiana Territory and Wisconsin and a lot of the frontier. And even Prairie du Chien in Wisconsin has fur trading posts there in the 18 teens and 20s. Okay, politics, what's going on? So as I said, there's this era of good feeling. Hinted to this before. We have sort of this Virginia dynasty that had been going on in the early part of the United States. If we look at almost all of our first presidents, except for Adams, they're all from Virginia. Washington's from Virginia, Jefferson's from Virginia, Madison's from Virginia, Monroe is from Virginia. All Virginians. Believe it or not, Virginia does not have the most people born in it that become president. Believe it or not, that's Ohio has had the most presidents born there. But Virginia is number 2. Anyway, so, and the other irony of this is most of them are slave owners. And it makes sense that Virginia would have a lot of presidents because at the time they had the largest population. So you'd electoral votes, and your odds are you're going to be a Virginian. James Monroe is going to replace Madison in getting elected in 1817. He is a Democratic Republican. We've kind of gotten rid of just calling them Republicans. They're now Democratic Republicans or DRs. And he wins, and he has a very balanced administration. The election of 1824, he wins pretty handily. Basically, he has a cabinet where he puts people from different areas of the country, and there's not a ton of internal fighting in this period of time. Now, I do want to talk about a few of the issues that happened during his presidency, but it's not a ton of internal conflict yet. We're headed there. So, what do we do? We're going to deal with Florida. So, Florida, oh, good, I can move myself. Florida, down here, is owned by the Spanish. Still a little bit of leftovers. And in fact, Andrew Jackson was sent to go after Native Americans in this area and actually goes into Spanish Florida when he was ordered not to. Gets involved in a big war. The Spanish are just like, this is ridiculous. But they also realize that Americans are almost unstoppable. There are very few Spaniards here. There are lots of Americans who'd like to move into Florida. Jackson ends up winning a war with the Seminoles and triumphs. And then Spain's like, all right, we don't really want to deal with this anymore. So Spain signs an agreement in 1819. What that agreement does is Florida goes to the United States, and we give up our claims anywhere in what is today Texas. So this red line becomes, under the Adams-Onis Treaty, the western boundary of the United States. Little do we know that this is quickly, within about 5 years, is going to become Mexico, which is going to be independence of Spain, and then within 30 years, the United States is going to take all this territory down to the current Mexican border, almost. So Monroe does accomplish expanding into Florida. Now, when James Monroe leaves the president, or during his presidency, he issues what is called the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine is a policy statement on foreign policy. It's usually what a doctrine is. There's some other doctrines, the Reagan Doctrine, There's a Truman Doctrine. We'll deal with a lot of doctrines here. But let's talk about the first one we really mentioned in class, which is the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe made a speech in 1823. Here's what he said. He said, Europeans, you need to stay out of the Americas. Why do they need to stay out of the Americas? Because a lot of the Central and South American countries had just declared their independence from Spain. So by 1823, you got places like Argentina, places like Venezuela, all Bolivia, all these places had just declared their independence from Spain, and Spain was not going to take them back. What James Monroe says is, Europe, you stay out of the Americas. The Americas should be free. Free. So it's a statement of support for democracy and self-government in the Americas. In exchange, the United States will stay out of European business. So that's the exchange. We're out of Europe, and the Americas should be the domain for Americans. That's the Monroe Doctrine. And in fact, arguably, we still follow a bit of the Monroe Doctrine, where I think America does still feel like our neighbors in the Americas are in our back pocket, and we're the ones who should mess with them, not Europeans. The other thing with the Monroe Doctrine is it articulates that America wants to be isolationist. We want to stay out of European business. Now, we don't have the power to stop Europeans from messing with the Americas. I would actually argue that what really stops the Europeans from messing with the Americas is the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the British Navy just making sure that there aren't any more conflicts out there. So a real desire for peace. There is going to be one problem during the Monroe presidency, and that is going to be the Panic of 1819. Panics are situations where the economy craters. We typically today call them recessions or depressions. A panic was where people freak out because they're afraid their bank is bankrupt. They run to the bank to try to take out all their money. And believe it or not, banks don't have all the money just sitting back there. They've lent out most of the money. So these panics, these economic catastrophes, really were literal panics. Like you could see people running down the street to get to a bank as quickly as possible to try to get their money out. So that's why we call them panics. But realistically, they trigger recessions or depressions. What had caused the Panic of 1819? Interest rates had been really low, meaning it was cheap to borrow money. People then borrowed money and bought land out west. They were buying land in particular in places like Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri. And they buy this land really cheap and they bid up the price of the land. However, there aren't as many settlers as anticipated. A lot of people had just bought land without knowing what it looked like. And after a while, if you can't pay off your debts, banks don't have money coming in. They have no money to send out, and it causes this spiral of bankruptcies and depression and panics. And a panic happens in a more modern economy. You don't really have economic panics when everybody's living on a farm. You don't really have an economic panic when everybody's a peasant. So we now have an economy that does have some industrialization. We have an economy where a lot of farmers own their own land and have borrowed money for that, and they got to pay it back. And if they aren't having money coming in because people aren't buying things, down. This is not the last panic we're going to talk about in this class. They're going to happen roughly every 20 years until 1907 when we have our last panic. You could argue the Great Depression is a giant panic too, but we'll get to that later. So that, my friends, is all we have for the era of good feeling and the politics of this era. Oh, we're going to get to some real problems here after that.